I was already halfway out of the church when my ex-wife leaned over and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "You shouldn't be here." Her voice wasn't angry. It was colder than that. "This wedding moved on without you years ago." I looked toward the front of the church where my daughter stood in her white dress, smiling nervously as guests settled into the pews. Then the pastor stepped forward, adjusted the microphone, and said something that made the entire room turn around and look at me. "Before we continue, stay with this story to the end, because sometimes the quietest moments in a family carry the deepest truths, and the people who think they've been written out of the story aren't always gone." The church smelled faintly of polished wood and lilies. Soft music floated through the room as guests found their seats. Conversations blended together in a low murmur that echoed off the high ceiling. I stood near the back of the sanctuary, unsure where to go. The invitation had said simply, "Please join us as Emily Whitmore marries Daniel Carter." No mention of seating arrangements, no note about family rows, just the date, the time, the address. For a moment, I considered leaving. It would have been easier. But when your only daughter gets married, you don't stay home because things are complicated. You show up, even if you're not sure anyone expects you to. I adjusted the sleeves of my jacket and stepped quietly into the last row of pews. The church had changed since the last time I'd been here. New carpeting, fresh paint along the walls, but the stained glass windows were the same. I remembered bringing Emily here when she was little, letting her stare up at the colors as the sunlight passed through. Back then, she used to ask questions about every detail. Why is that man holding a staff? Why is that window blue instead of red? Her curiosity had been endless, and for a long time, I had been the one answering. That was before the divorce. 8 years ago, Laura and I ended our marriage quietly. No shouting matches, no dramatic court battles, just the slow realization that we had built two separate lives under the same roof. Emily was 17 then, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to choose how she responded. At first, she stayed neutral. She visited both houses, called regularly, kept her routine steady. But over time, something shifted. Laura was always better at staying close to people. She organized things, remembered birthdays, planned holidays. I handled problems, when the car broke down, when paperwork needed sorting, when someone had to stay calm during stressful moments. It worked during the marriage. After the divorce, it meant I was around less. Laura hosted dinners. Laura attended every school event. Laura stayed connected to the social circles that surrounded Emily's life. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, I became the quieter parent. Still present, just further away. When Emily went to college, we talked occasionally. Phone calls every few weeks, text messages on birthdays, photos sent during holidays. Nothing dramatic, just distance that felt natural over time. So when the invitation arrived 3 months ago, I was surprised. Not offended, just surprised. The envelope had been addressed carefully, in Emily's handwriting. No long note inside, just the invitation. I took that as a sign, not a big emotional gesture, just an acknowledgement. You're still my father, you can come. And that was enough. Now, sitting quietly in the last row of the church, I watched guests continue to arrive. Clusters of relatives filled the middle rows. Friends from Emily's college laughed softly near the front. Someone adjusted a camera tripod near the aisle. Everything felt organized, structured, like a day that had been planned carefully for months. Then the side doors opened. Laura stepped inside. Even after 8 years, I recognized her immediately. Her hair was shorter now, styled neatly around her shoulders. She wore a pale green dress that matched the floral arrangements near the altar. Several guests greeted her warmly as she moved down the aisle. She smiled easily, confident, comfortable. This was clearly her environment. For a moment, she didn't notice me. Then her eyes reached the back row and stopped. Our gazes held for a second. Not hostile, just complicated. Laura walked toward me slowly. The music in the church softened as the musicians prepared for the ceremony to begin. She stopped beside the pew. "You came," she said quietly. "Yes." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she glanced around the sanctuary. "You're sitting back here?" I didn't want to interfere with anything. Laura studied my face. Her expression wasn't angry, but it wasn't welcoming either. "You know Emily's stepfather's walking her down the aisle." I assumed that. "Good." She nodded slightly. Because in that moment, I realized she wasn't checking to see if I was comfortable. She was checking to see if I understood my place. Laura leaned a little closer. "You shouldn't create confusion today," she added softly. I felt my shoulders tighten slightly. "I'm just here to watch my daughter get married." "That's all?" "Yes." Laura held my gaze for a moment longer. Then she said the sentence I hadn't expected. "You don't really belong in this part of her life anymore." The words were quiet, but they landed harder than if she'd raised her voice. Before I could respond, the church music shifted. The ceremony was beginning. Laura straightened and walked back towards the front rows without another word. I remained in the last pew, hands folded, eyes fixed on the altar, trying to focus on the moment, trying not to think about what she had just said. A few minutes later, the pastor stepped forward. He adjusted the microphone and smiled at the gathered guests. "Before we begin," he said warmly, "there is someone here today whose presence is important to this ceremony." The room grew quieter. I assumed he meant a grandparent or an elderly relative. Then he looked toward the back of the church, directly at me, and said, "Mr. Whitmore, would you please stand for a moment?" For a moment, I didn't move. Not because I hadn't heard him, but because I was certain he couldn't possibly be speaking to me. The pastor stood near the altar, one hand resting lightly on the wooden podium. His expression was calm, patient, as if he had expected this pause. Several guests turned their heads toward the back of the church. Their eyes followed his gaze, toward me. My name had been spoken clearly. "Mr. Whitmore, would you please stand?" The room had grown quieter than it had been all morning. I slowly placed my hands on the edge of the pew and rose to my feet. Dozens of people were now looking at me, some curious, some confused, a few whispering softly to each other. At the front of the church, Laura's head turned sharply. Her expression was hard to read from across the room, but I could see the tension in her posture. The pastor smiled gently. "Thank you." He paused for a moment, allowing the room to settle. "Today is a day about two people beginning a new chapter of their lives," he said. "But before we move forward with that chapter, it's important to recognize the people who helped write the earlier ones." A few guests nodded quietly. The pastor continued. "Emily and Daniel have spent months planning this ceremony, and during those conversations, Emily told me something she wanted to make sure was not forgotten today." My attention sharpened. Emily had asked for this? The pastor glanced toward the side doors, where the bridal party would soon enter. "Every life," he said, "is shaped by the people who raise us, guide us, and teach us what love looks like." His voice carried easily through the church. "And sometimes those influences are quiet. Sometimes they happen behind the scenes, but they matter just as deeply." The room remained completely silent. Then the pastor looked at me again. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "Emily asked me to thank you today." A soft murmur moved through the pews. Laura's face had gone completely still. The pastor continued. "She told me that when she was young, you were the person who taught her patience." A small smile appeared on his face. "She said you were the one who helped her learn how to solve problems calmly instead of reacting to them emotionally." I felt something tighten in my chest. The pastor's tone remained warm. "She told me that whenever something broke in the house, you would sit beside her and explain how to fix it instead of simply doing it yourself." A few guests chuckled softly. The pastor nodded. "She said those moments taught her something she still carries into her life today." Across the church, Laura shifted slightly in her seat. The pastor continued speaking. "She said you were the person who reminded her that mistakes are not disasters. They're just problems waiting for solutions." For the first time that morning, I saw movement near the side entrance. The wedding coordinator was preparing the bridal party. The ceremony would begin any moment. But the pastor wasn't finished. "Emily also told me something else," he said. "She said, even after her parents divorced, her father never spoke badly about her mother." The room grew very still. "She said he chose silence instead of bitterness." I swallowed slowly, because I remembered those years, the careful conversations, the moments where I stopped myself from saying things that might have hurt Emily more than they helped. The pastor rested his hands on the podium. "She told me that watching that quiet respect taught her what maturity looks like." He glanced briefly toward the side doors again, then back at me. "So before we begin this wedding, Emily wanted one thing acknowledged clearly." His voice softened. "Some of the values that shaped the woman standing at that altar today came from the man standing in the back of this church." A gentle ripple of applause began in the pews, not loud, but sincere. My instinct was to sit down quickly, but the pastor raised a hand. "One more moment, please." The applause faded again. He looked toward the side doors. "The bride asked me to make sure her father was standing before she entered." My breath caught slightly, because suddenly I understood. The doors behind the altar opened slowly. Emily stepped into the entrance of the sanctuary. Her wedding dress shimmered softly in the light from the stained glass windows. For a second, she looked toward the front of the church, where her stepfather stood near the aisle. Then she turned her head and looked directly toward the back, toward me. Our eyes met across the room. She smiled. Not politely, not nervously, but warmly, like a daughter recognizing someone important in the crowd. Then she nodded once, a small gesture, almost private, but unmistakable. The message was clear. I hadn't come to interfere with the ceremony, and I hadn't come to prove anything. But in that quiet moment, I realized something Laura hadn't. Belonging isn't decided by who walks someone down the aisle. Sometimes it's decided by the years that happened long before the music started. And as the wedding music began to play, I remained quietly standing in the back of the church, while my daughter began walking toward the front.
The music filled the church slowly. Soft piano first, then the quiet rise of the violin. Every guest turned toward the aisle as Emily stepped forward. Her stepfather, Martin, stood waiting near the front row. He looked proud, straightening his suit jacket as she approached him. Martin had been part of Emily's life for nearly 7 years. He wasn't a bad man. That had always made things more complicated. If he had been cruel or arrogant, the situation would have been easier to define. Instead, Martin was polite, responsible, reliable, the the kind of man who showed up to every school function and remembered everyone's names. Emily reached him at the front of the aisle. He smiled at her, offered his arm, and together they began the slow walk toward the altar. The guests watched quietly as they passed each row. Some smiled, some wiped their eyes. I remained standing at the back of the church. The pastor hadn't asked me to sit yet, and somehow it felt wrong to move before the moment had fully settled. As Emily walked forward, her eyes briefly scanned the room again. When they reached the back row, she gave me another small smile. Not dramatic, just steady. Then she turned back toward the altar. Laura sat near the front of the church beside several relatives. From where I stood, I could see her posture stiffen slightly as the ceremony began. She hadn't expected the pastor to mention me. That much was clear, and honestly, neither had I. The pastor waited until Emily reached the front beside Daniel. Daniel Carter looked both nervous and happy in the way grooms often do. He squeezed Emily's hand gently. The pastor then motioned toward the first pew. "Mr. Whitmore, you may sit." I nodded slightly and lowered myself back onto the bench. The room returned its attention to the ceremony. The pastor opened with a short welcome, speaking about marriage as a partnership built over time. His voice carried smoothly through the sanctuary, but my thoughts drifted. I watched Emily standing at the altar, her shoulders relaxed, her smile calm. She looked confident, grounded. For a moment, I thought back to a memory I hadn't considered in years. Emily was 9 years old. Her bicycle chain had slipped off while she was riding near the driveway. She had marched straight into the garage, angry and frustrated. "It's broken," she said. I had knelt beside the bike and turned it upside down. "It's not broken," I told her. "Then why doesn't it work?" "Because one small piece moved out of place." I handed her a rag. "Come here, I'll show you." She had crouched beside me while I explained how the gears worked. 10 minutes later, she was riding again. That had always been our relationship, quiet problem-solving, not big speeches, not emotional declarations, just steady moments that built trust over time. Now she stood at the altar, beginning a new life. The pastor turned to Martin. "Who gives this woman to be married?" Martin answered clearly, "I do." He kissed Emily on the cheek and stepped back to his seat beside Laura. The ceremony moved forward smoothly. Vows were exchanged, promises spoken. Daniel's voice shook slightly when he said the words, "for better or worse." Emily's voice stayed steady. The guests smiled warmly as the two of them slipped rings onto each other's fingers. Everything unfolded exactly as weddings usually do. But I noticed something subtle. Every few minutes, Emily glanced briefly toward the back of the church. Not obviously, just quick, quiet checks, almost like she was making sure something important was still there. About halfway through the ceremony, the pastor paused again. "There is one tradition Emily asked to include today," he said. The guests looked curious. The pastor smiled gently. "He told me that while planning this wedding, she thought a lot about the people who shaped her understanding of commitment." He glanced toward the front rows. "Her mother has clearly played a large role in that." Laura nodded slightly. Then the pastor continued, "But she also told me that the person who taught her the most about patience and quiet responsibility is sitting in the back of this church." Several heads turned again. The pastor lifted a hand. Emily asked if he would come forward for just a moment. I felt my chest tighten slightly, because now there was no misunderstanding. He meant me. The guests shifted in their seats as they waited. Emily turned around fully now, facing the back of the church. Our eyes met again. Her expression was calm, reassuring. Then she said something softly into the microphone clipped to her dress. "Dad, could you come here?" The word echoed through the sanctuary. Dad, not Aaron, not Mr. Whitmore, just Dad. For a moment, I didn't move, not because I didn't want to, but because 8 years of quiet distance suddenly felt present in that single word. Then Daniel smiled and encouragingly nodded. The pastor stepped aside from the aisle, and the entire church turned to watch as I slowly stood from the last row and began walking toward the front.
The walk from the back of the church to the altar felt longer than it should have. Not physically, just emotionally. Every step carried 8 years of distance, 8 years of quiet phone calls, missed holidays, polite conversations that never quite returned to what they once were. Guests shifted slightly in their seats as I moved down the aisle. Some smiled politely, some looked curious. Others glanced toward Laura, trying to read her reaction. Laura sat perfectly still. Her expression wasn't angry, but it was tight, controlled. Martin leaned slightly toward her and whispered something I couldn't hear. She didn't respond. At the altar, Emily and Daniel waited patiently. Daniel stepped slightly to the side as I approached. The pastor greeted me with a gentle nod. "Thank you for coming forward, Mr. Whitmore." I stood beside Emily now. Up close, I could see the small details in her expression, the slight nervousness around her eyes, the careful way she was holding her bouquet. But beneath it all, she looked happy and steady. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. The microphone on her dress caught the word clearly. A quiet ripple moved through the guests. "Hi, Em," I replied. For a moment, neither of us said anything else. The pastor stepped forward again. "Emily asked for a short moment during this ceremony," he said, addressing the guests, "not as a formal tradition, but as something personal." He turned slightly toward Emily. "Whenever you're ready." Emily nodded. Then she turned toward me. "I know this probably feels strange," she said quietly. The room was silent. "But when Daniel and I started planning this wedding, I kept thinking about something." She glanced briefly at Daniel, then back at me. "People kept asking who was walking me down the aisle." Her voice remained calm. "And technically, that was Martin." She looked toward her stepfather and smiled kindly. "Martin has been wonderful to our family." Martin nodded politely from the front row. Emily continued, "But the truth is, walking down an aisle doesn't really define who helped raise someone." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them filled the room. Emily shifted her bouquet to one hand. "When I was little, Dad was the person who helped me figure things out." She looked at me again. "When something broke, he didn't fix it for me, he showed me how." A few guests smiled softly. "When I got frustrated with school, he didn't panic. He told me to slow down and think." Her voice softened slightly. "And when Mom and Dad divorced, he never tried to turn me against anyone." Laura lowered her eyes briefly. Emily continued speaking. "He just kept showing up." The pastor nodded gently beside us. Emily took a small breath. "So today, before I start this new part of my life, I wanted to acknowledge something that never really got said out loud." She turned toward the guests. "My father may not have been the one walking beside me today." Then she turned back to me. "But he's still one of the reasons I know how to walk forward at all." The words hung quietly in the church, not dramatic, just honest. Emily then did something unexpected. She handed her bouquet to Daniel, then she stepped forward and hugged me. For a moment, the room seemed to stop completely. Her arms wrapped around my shoulders, careful not to wrinkle her dress. I hesitated only briefly before returning the hug. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "I wouldn't have missed it." When she stepped back, her eyes were slightly bright, but she was smiling. The pastor cleared his throat gently. "Well, I think that was worth the short pause in our ceremony." A few quiet laughs moved through the room. Emily picked up her bouquet again. Then the pastor looked toward me. "You may return to your seat, Mr. Whitmore." I nodded. Before turning back down the aisle, I glanced briefly toward Laura. Our eyes met. This time, her expression wasn't cold. It wasn't even defensive. It looked thoughtful, like she was reconsidering something she had believed earlier. Then I walked quietly back to the last row of the church. The ceremony continued. Vows finished, rings exchanged, and a few minutes later, the pastor raised his hands with a smile. "By the authority entrusted to me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The church erupted in applause as Daniel kissed Emily. Everyone stood, including me. But as the guests celebrated, I noticed Laura watching from the front row, and the look on her face suggested that the moment hadn't gone the way she expected at all. The applause filled the church as Daniel and Emily turned toward the guests. The pastor stepped aside, smiling as the newly married couple began walking back down the aisle together. Everyone stood, phones lifted to take pictures, laughter mixed with soft conversation. It was the moment every wedding builds toward, the release of all the quiet tension that gathers during the ceremony. I remained standing in the last row as they approached. Emily slowed slightly when she reached the back. For a brief second, she squeezed my hand as she passed. "See you at the reception," she said quietly. "Of course," I replied. Then she and Daniel disappeared through the side doors with the rest of the wedding party. The guests slowly began filing out of the church. Conversations picked up again, louder now. People congratulated each other, adjusted jackets, gathered purses and coats. I waited for most of the crowd to leave before stepping into the aisle. I wasn't trying to avoid anyone, but I also didn't feel the need to rush into the middle of things. As I reached the church entrance, I heard footsteps behind me. "Aaron." I turned. Laura was walking toward me. Her posture was different now, less rigid than earlier. The crowd continued moving around us toward the parking lot, but she stopped a few feet away. "That was unexpected," she said. "Yes." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Laura glanced back toward the empty sanctuary. "I didn't know Emily planned that." "I didn't either." She nodded slowly. "I suppose I should have." Her tone carried a quiet self-awareness. Laura looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "I said something to you earlier," she said. "Yes. I told you that you didn't belong in that part of her life." I waited. Laura sighed lightly. "I was wrong." The words were simple, but hearing them felt heavier than I expected. "I wasn't trying to start a conflict," she continued. "I just thought the ceremony would be easier if things stayed structured." "Structured," I repeated. "Yes." She gave a small, self-conscious smile. "I've always believed events run better when everyone knows their role." "That sounds like you." Laura laughed quietly. "It does, doesn't it?" For a moment, we stood there watching guests cross the parking lot outside the church. Cars started, doors closed, voices echoed across the pavement. Laura folded her arms loosely. "You know," she said, "Emily talked about you more than you probably realized." That surprised me. "Did she?" "Yes. Not constantly, but when she ran into problems, she still referenced things you used to say."
Laura tilted her head slightly. The whole slow down and think before reacting speech apparently stuck with her. I smiled faintly. I said that a lot. I know. Laura studied my face for a moment. I think I underestimated how much of you stayed with her. That happens. Yes. She nodded thoughtfully. When we divorced, I assumed time would sort things out. In what way? That she'd naturally move closer to whichever parent she saw more often. And she did. To some extent. Laura paused. But relationships aren't always measured by how often people see each other. The honesty in her voice felt sincere, not defensive, just reflective. Outside, the wedding photographer was organizing guests for group pictures. The reception would start soon at a nearby hall. Laura glanced toward the parking lot. "We should probably head over," she said. "Yes." She hesitated slightly before adding, "I'm glad you came today." "So am I." Laura nodded once more. Then she said something that carried a quiet shift in tone. "Emily's starting a new chapter now." "Yes. And I think it might be time for the rest of us to stop holding on to the old ones so tightly." I considered that for a moment. Maybe so. Laura gave a small smile. "Well." She stepped toward the door. "I'll see you at the reception." I watched her walk outside, joining a group of relatives near the parking lot. The air outside was bright and warm. Wedding guests moved in small clusters toward their cars, still laughing and talking about the ceremony. I stepped onto the church steps and paused for a moment. The stained glass windows behind me glowed in the afternoon sun. Inside that church, something small but important had shifted. Not a dramatic reconciliation, not a sudden reunion, just a quiet correction, a reminder that distance doesn't erase the years that came before it. Across the parking lot, Emily spotted me again while standing with Daniel and the photographer. She waved. I waved back. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like the space between us wasn't quite as wide as it used to be. Because sometimes, belonging doesn't come from where you sit in the room. Sometimes it comes from the simple fact that when the moment mattered most, you were still there.